Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. The elevator doors opened on the lobby floor at exactly 11:43 in the evening, and Marcus Chen stepped inside with his briefcase and a headache that had been building since the conference ended 3 hours earlier. He pressed the button for the 14th floor, watching the brass panel light up with a soft glow. The hotel was one of those older establishments in central Hong Kong, the kind with marble columns in the lobby and carpets that smelled faintly of must and expensive cologne. Marcus had stayed in dozens of hotels like this one, always the same routine, always the same tired amenities dressed up as luxury. The elevator began its ascent with a mechanical hum that seemed louder than it should have been in the empty cabin. He leaned against the back wall and closed his eyes, listening to the soft chime as the numbers climbed. 3, 5, 6, 7. He opened his eyes and stared at the panel. The elevator had jumped from 3 directly to 5. No 4th floor. He blinked, wondering if he had simply missed it, if exhaustion was playing tricks on him. But no, the sequence was clear. 3, then 5. Marcus had been staying at the Peninsula Grand for 4 nights already, attending a series of financial meetings that stretched long into the evenings and left him drained. He was a senior analyst for a multinational firm, the kind of job that required constant travel, constant performance, constant navigation of cultural nuances and unspoken hierarchies. Hong Kong was familiar to him. He had been here a dozen times over the past 5 years. But this particular hotel was new. His company had been here a dozen times. Booked it last minute, after their usual accommodation had been overbooked during some kind of festival he hadn't bothered to learn the name of. The Peninsula Grand had decent reviews, a respectable reputation, and a location close enough to the financial district that he could walk to his meetings if the traffic became unbearable. It was functional. Unremarkable. The room was clean, the bed was firm, the shower had good water pressure. That was all he needed. He hadn't paid much attention to anything else. The staff were polite but distant. The other guests were mostly business travelers like himself, and the building had that generic 5-star aesthetic that could have belonged to any city in the world. Marcus preferred it that way. He didn't want character or charm. He wanted efficiency and silence. He wanted to sleep and wake up and move through his schedule without disruption. But now, standing in the elevator and staring at the panel where the number 4 should have appeared, he felt a small, uncomfortable itch at the back of his mind. It was the kind of detail that most people would dismiss immediately, a quirk of the building, a design choice, maybe even a cultural superstition. He knew that the number 4 was considered unlucky in Chinese culture, associated with death because of its phonetic similarity to the word for dying. Many buildings in Hong Kong skipped the 4th floor entirely, along with the 13th for Western sensibilities and any other floor numbers containing the digit 4. It was common, rational. There was no 4th floor because no one wanted to stay on the 4th floor. The elevator simply reflected that reality. Marcus told himself this as the cabin continued upward, passing floors 8, 9, 10. But the itch remained. He reached his room a few minutes later, slid the keycard through the lock, and stepped into the familiar stillness of a space that belonged to no one. The bed was made with crisp white sheets. The curtains were drawn, and a single lamp glowed on the desk beside a leather-bound hotel directory he had never opened. Marcus dropped his briefcase on the chair, loosened his tie, and walked to the window. The city stretched out below him, a glittering grid of lights and movement that never seemed to stop. He could see the harbor in the distance, the dark water reflecting the glow of the skyline, and beyond that, the shadowy outlines of mountains rising against the night sky. It was beautiful in an impersonal way, like a postcard or a screensaver. He watched it for a moment, then turned away and began his nightly routine. Shower, check emails, set an alarm. He was in bed by 12:30, and sleep came quickly, heavy and dreamless. The next morning passed without incident. Meetings, lunch with clients, more meetings. Marcus returned to the hotel just after 9 in the evening, exhausted again, his mind full of numbers and projections and negotiations that had gone slightly better than expected. He took the elevator up to his floor, watched it skip from 3 to 5 without really thinking about it, and collapsed into bed. The following day was the same, and the day after that. By the 5th night, Marcus had stopped noticing the missing 4th floor altogether. It had become part of the pattern, just another detail in the background of his routine. But on the 6th night, something changed. Marcus stepped into the elevator at 11:20, the same as always, and pressed the button for the 14th floor. The doors closed with a soft hiss, and the cabin began to rise. 3, 5, 6. He glanced at the panel out of habit, confirming the sequence, but then his eyes caught on something that made him freeze. The button for the 4th floor was glowing, not just present, but lit up, as if someone had pressed it, as if the elevator intended to stop there. Marcus stared at it, his fingers still hovering near the panel. He hadn't pressed it. He was certain of that. There was no one else in the elevator. The button shouldn't even exist, shouldn't even be functional, but there it was, glowing with a pale yellow light that seemed dimmer than the others, almost sickly. The elevator slowed. The hum of the machinery shifted in tone, and Marcus felt his stomach drop as the cabin came to a stop. The number 4 appeared on the digital display above the doors. A soft chime echoed in the small space. The doors began to open. Marcus didn't move. He stood there, briefcase in hand, staring at the widening gap as a hallway came into view. It was dimly lit, bathed in a reddish glow that seemed to come from old incandescent bulbs spaced too far apart along the ceiling. The carpet was a deep burgundy, worn and faded in places, and the walls were covered in dark wood paneling that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. There were doors on either side of the hallway, identical doors with brass numbers that gleamed dully in the red shadows. Marcus could see the nearest one. It was labeled 401, but beneath the number, affixed to the door with what looked like a small brass plate, was a name. His name, Marcus Chen. He took a step back, pressing himself against the rear wall of the elevator. His heart was pounding now, a sudden adrenaline spike that made his hands shake. He jabbed the button for the 14th floor, pressing it repeatedly, but nothing happened. The button wouldn't light up. He tried the closed door button, the lobby button, every button on the panel, but none of them responded. The elevator just sat there, doors wide open, waiting. The hallway beyond was silent. No sound of footsteps, no hum of air conditioning, no distant murmur of television sets or conversations. Just silence, thick and heavy, pressing in from the red-lit corridor. Marcus forced himself to breathe slowly, trying to think rationally. This was a mistake, a malfunction. The elevator had stopped on a floor that wasn't supposed to exist, or maybe it was a service, level, a storage area, something that guests weren't meant to access. The name on the door was a coincidence, or a prank, or something his exhausted mind was misinterpreting. He needed to get out of the elevator, find the stairs, and walk up to his floor. That was the logical solution, but he didn't move, because as he stood there, staring at the door labeled with his name, he noticed something else. There were more doors down the hallway, stretching into the dim distance, and on each one he could see the faint glint of brass plates. He couldn't read them from where he stood, but he had the terrible sinking feeling that they all said the same thing. Marcus stepped out of the elevator. He didn't know why. Every instinct screamed at him to stay inside the cabin, to wait for the doors to close, to find some way to override the controls and force the elevator back into motion. But his legs moved anyway, carrying him forward onto the burgundy carpet, and the moment his foot touched the floor, he felt a change in the air. It was colder here, noticeably colder, and the smell was different. Not unpleasant exactly, but strange, like old paper and metal and something faintly sweet that he couldn't identify. The elevator doors closed behind him with a soft click. Marcus spun around, reaching for them, but there was no button to call the elevator back. No panel on the wall, no emergency phone, nothing. Just smooth wood paneling and the faint outline of where the doors had been. He turned back to the hallway, his breath coming faster now, and walked toward the nearest door, 401. The brass plate beneath the number read Marcus Chen in small, precise letters. He reached out and touched it, half expecting it to be an illusion, a trick of the light, but the metal was solid and cool under his fingertips. He tried the handle. It didn't turn. Locked. He moved to the next door. 402, the same name. Marcus Chen. He walked faster now, checking each door, and every single one bore his name on a brass plate that looked freshly polished. 403, 404, 405. His name repeated down the entire length of the hallway, which seemed to stretch farther than should have been possible given the dimensions of the building. Marcus stopped in the middle of the corridor, his mind racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He was hallucinating, or dreaming, or having some kind of breakdown brought on by stress and exhaustion. But the cold air felt real. The carpet under his feet felt real. The brass plates reflected his face in distorted miniature, and that felt horribly, undeniably real. He walked back toward where the elevator had been, running his hands along the wall, searching for any seam or mechanism that might open the doors again. There was nothing. The wood was smooth and unbroken, and when he pressed his ear against it, he couldn't hear any machinery, any sound of movement from the shaft beyond. It was as if the elevator had never existed. Marcus pulled out his phone, hands shaking, and stared at the screen. No signal, not even emergency calls available. The time read 11:38, but he couldn't tell if it was accurate. Everything felt suspended, frozen in the red dimness of this impossible floor. He turned and walked down the hallway again, trying doors at random, but none of them opened. He called out, his voice sounding flat and strange in the thick silence, but no one answered. After what felt like an hour, but might have been only minutes, Marcus reached the end of the hallway. There was a window there, a tall, narrow window with frosted glass that let in no light from outside. He pressed his face against it, trying to see through, but the glass was too opaque. He could make out vague shapes, shadows, but nothing definite. He slammed his palm against the window in frustration, and the sound echoed down the hallway behind him, a sharp crack that seemed to linger too long. Then he heard something else. A soft sound, barely audible, coming from one of the doors, a rustling like paper being moved. Marcus froze, listening. The sound came again, and this time he could pinpoint it. 407. He approached the door slowly, every muscle in his body tense. The brass plate gleamed in the red light. Marcus Chen. The rustling continued, rhythmic now, deliberate. Someone was inside. Or something. Marcus pressed his ear against the door, hardly daring to breathe. The sound was clearer now. It was paper, he was certain, pages being turned or sorted, and beneath that a faint creaking, like someone shifting in a chair. He knocked, 3 sharp raps that hurt his knuckles. The rustling stopped immediately. Silence. Marcus waited, his heart hammering. Then, slowly, he heard footsteps approaching the door from the other side. Soft, measured footsteps on what sounded like a hard floor, not carpet. They stopped just on the other side of the door. Marcus could sense a presence there, inches away, separated only by the wood. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask who was there, to demand answers, but before he could form the words, he heard a voice, his voice, speaking from the other side of the door, quiet and calm and wrong. It said, "You're not supposed to be here yet." Marcus stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat. The voice had been his, unmistakably his, the same tone and inflection he heard in recordings. But there was something hollow about it, something that made his skin crawl. He turned and ran, his footsteps pounding on the carpet, past door after door bearing his name, until he reached the place where the elevator should have been. He slammed both fists against the wall, shouting now, demanding to be let out, but the wood didn't yield. The hallway remained silent behind him, except for his own ragged breathing. Then the lights went out. Not all at once, but in sequence, starting from the far end of the hallway where the window was. One by one, the red bulbs flickered and died, plunging sections of the corridor into absolute darkness, and the darkness moved toward him like a living thing. Marcus pressed himself against the wall, watching in horror as the shadows advanced, swallowing door after door. He heard sounds in the darkness, soft sounds, whispers that might have been voices, or might have been the building settling, or might have been nothing at all. The final light above his head flickered. Marcus closed his eyes, and in that moment of blindness he felt the air shift. A breath of warmth against his face, the faint smell of coffee and paper, the sense of someone standing very close. He opened his eyes and the light was back, not the red glow of the hallway, but the bright fluorescent wash of the elevator interior. He was inside the cabin, standing in the exact position he had been in when the doors first opened. The panel showed the number 5, and the elevator was moving again, continuing its ascent. 6, 7, 8, Marcus didn't move. He stared at the panel, at the buttons, and saw that the 4th floor button was no longer glowing. In fact, it wasn't there at all, just a smooth gap in the sequence where it should have been. The elevator reached the 14th floor, and the doors opened with a cheerful chime. Marcus stepped out on shaking legs and walked to his room, moving on autopilot. He unlocked the door, went inside, and sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the lights. His phone had a signal again. The time was 11:45. 7 minutes had passed since he entered the elevator. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He sat in the chair by the window, watching the city lights, and trying to convince himself that he had imagined everything, that stress and exhaustion had combined to create a vivid hallucination, but he couldn't shake the memory of his own voice speaking from behind that door, couldn't forget the brass plates with his name repeated endlessly down an impossible hallway. When morning came, he checked out of the hotel immediately, inventing an excuse about a family emergency. The receptionist processed his early departure without comment, smiling politely and wishing him a safe journey. Marcus asked, casually, if the hotel had a 4th floor. The receptionist looked confused for a moment, then smiled again and said no, of course not. The building skips the 4th floor. It's traditional. Marcus nodded and left, pulling his suitcase through the lobby and out into the bright morning heat. He never stayed at the Peninsula Grand again, but sometimes, Late at night, in whatever hotel he found himself in, Marcus would stand in front of the elevator and watch the numbers climb, and he would wonder what would happen if, somewhere, in some building, the doors opened on a floor that shouldn't exist. A floor where every door had his name. A floor where something that sounded like him waited patiently for his return. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best, but as unsettling as that story was, it's far from the only time a hotel has become the stage for inexplicable horror. Across Asia, travelers have reported encounters that defy rational explanation. Moments where the familiar safety of a rented room transforms into something far more sinister. In Thailand, one particular room has gained a reputation among locals, a place where guests receive warnings they cannot ignore, calls from a front desk that isn't calling, and a phone line that should have been disconnected years ago. What happens when you answer a call from the dead? This is the story of room 308. The phone rang at exactly midnight, shrill and insistent, cutting through the quiet darkness of the hotel room like a blade. Sarah jolted awake, her heart already racing before her mind had fully processed the sound. Beside her, Tom groaned and reached across the nightstand, fumbling for the receiver. He lifted it to his ear, his voice thick with sleep. "Hello?" There was a pause, and Sarah watched her husband's face change in the dim light filtering through the curtains, watched his expression shift from irritation to confusion. He said hello again, more forcefully this time, but then he pulled the phone away from his ear and stared at it as if it had bitten him. He pressed it back, listened for another moment, then hung up without saying anything else. Sarah propped herself up on one elbow. Who was it? Tom shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. They said we needed to leave. Leave the room. Leave now." Sarah blinked, trying to make sense of this through the fog of interrupted sleep. "What? Who said that?" Tom reached for his phone on the nightstand and turned on its flashlight, sweeping the beam around the room. It sounded like the front desk. A woman. She said we needed to check out of room 308 immediately, that it wasn't safe. Sarah sat up fully now, pulling the sheet around her shoulders. That doesn't make sense. Why would they call at midnight to tell us that? Tom was already getting out of bed, walking to the door. "I'm going down there. This is ridiculous. If there's a problem with the room, they should have told us before we checked in." Sarah and Tom Mitchell were 3 days into a 2-week holiday in Thailand, their first real vacation in almost 4 years. They were both teachers in Melbourne, accustomed to long work hours and short breaks. And this trip had been planned and saved for over 18 months. Thailand had seemed like the perfect choice, affordable, beautiful, full of temples and beaches and food they were excited to try. They had spent their first 2 nights in Bangkok, overwhelmed by the noise and heat and crowds. And then they had taken a bus north to Chiang Mai, looking forward to something quieter, more manageable. The Lotus Garden Hotel had been chosen almost at random from a list of mid-range options on a booking website. The photos showed a small, clean property with traditional Thai architectural elements, a courtyard garden, and rooms that looked simple but comfortable. The reviews were mostly positive, with occasional complaints about the age of the building or the firmness of the mattresses, nothing that concerned them. They had checked in late in the afternoon after a long bus ride, both of them tired and ready to shower and sleep. The receptionist had been a young woman with excellent English and a shy smile, and she had handed them a key attached to a heavy brass tag marked 308. Their room was on the 3rd floor, accessed by a narrow staircase since the hotel had no elevator. It was small, but clean, with 2 single beds pushed together, a tiny bathroom, a wooden wardrobe, and a window that overlooked the courtyard. There was a telephone on the nightstand between the beds, an old rotary model that looked like it belonged in a museum. Sarah had pointed at it and laughed, asking Tom if he even knew how to use one. They had gone out for dinner, walked around the night market, and returned to the room around 10. Both of them had fallen asleep quickly, exhausted from travel, and then the phone had rung. Tom returned from the lobby 15 minutes later, looking annoyed and confused. Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed with the lights on, fully awake now. "Well?" Tom sat down beside her and rubbed his eyes. "There's no one at the front desk. I mean, no one. The lobby's empty. There's a bell to ring for service, but no one came, even after I rang it like 10 times. Sarah frowned. "That's weird. Hotels always have someone at the desk at night, don't they?" Tom shrugged. "You'd think so. I waited for a few minutes, but no one showed up. I thought about just going behind the desk to check the phone system, but that seemed like a bad idea." He glanced at the telephone on the nightstand. Maybe it was a wrong number. Maybe someone called the wrong room. Sarah picked up the receiver and held it to her ear. There was no dial tone, just silence. She pressed the button that should have connected her to the front desk, held it down for several seconds, then released it. Nothing. She hung up and looked at Tom. There's no signal. The phone's not connected. Tom took the receiver from her and tried it himself, pressing buttons, listening, then examining the cord where it connected to the base and the wall. "It looks connected," he said slowly. "But you're right. There's nothing. No tone." Sarah felt a cold, prickling sensation at the back of her neck. "Then how did it ring? How did you hear someone talking?" Tom didn't answer. He sat there holding the dead receiver, staring at it, and Sarah could see him trying to logic his way through the situation, trying to find a rational explanation. Finally, he said, "Maybe the line just dropped. Maybe it was working a minute ago and now it's not. These old systems are probably unreliable." Sarah wanted to believe that, but something about the whole situation felt wrong. The empty lobby, the dead phone line, the woman's voice telling them to leave immediately. She stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain to look down at the courtyard. It was empty and still, lit by a few dim lanterns hanging from the eaves of the building. Everything looked normal, peaceful. Tom came up behind her and put a hand on her shoulder. "Let's just go back to sleep," he said. "If there was a real emergency, someone would come and tell us. We're probably overthinking this." Sarah nodded, though she didn't feel convinced. They turned off the lights and got back into bed, but sleep didn't come easily this time. Sarah lay in the darkness, listening to Tom's breathing gradually slow and deepen, and stared at the phone on the nightstand. At some point she must have drifted off, because the next thing she knew, it was ringing again. This time, Sarah was the one who answered. She grabbed the receiver before Tom could wake fully, pressing it to her ear, ready to demand answers. The voice that came through was female, soft and urgent, speaking in accented English. "You need to leave room 308. Please. It's not safe for you there." Sarah's mouth was dry. "Who is this? Why do you keep calling?" There was a pause, and in the background, Sarah could hear a strange sound, like wind or static, but with a rhythmic quality that reminded her of breathing. The voice spoke again, and now it sounded frightened. "Please listen. Room 308 is not for guests. It was sealed. You shouldn't be there. You need to go now, before it's too late." Sarah felt her hands starting to shake. "Before? What's too late? What are you talking about?" But the line went dead, and when she tried to call back, pressing every button on the phone, there was still no dial tone. Tom was awake now, sitting up and watching her. What did they say? Sarah repeated the conversation, her voice unsteady, and Tom's expression grew more troubled with each sentence. "This is insane," he said. "Room 308 is sealed. We're literally staying in it. How could it be sealed?" Sarah put the phone down and stood up, turning on the bedside lamp. "I want to go down to the lobby again, right now. I want to talk to whoever's working there and figure out what's going on." Tom nodded and reached for his jeans. They dressed quickly and left the room, making sure to take the key with them. The hallway outside was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, and their footsteps echoed on the old wooden floorboards as they walked to the staircase. The lobby was just as empty as Tom had described, a small rectangular space with a wooden desk, a few chairs, and a wall of cubbyholes for room keys behind the reception area. There was no one there. Sarah rang the bell on the desk, a small brass dome that produced a bright ding, and they waited. Nothing. She rang it again, holding it down longer this time, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet building. Tom walked over to a bulletin board on the wall, examining the various notices and maps pinned there. "Sarah," he said quietly, "come, look at this." She joined him and followed his gaze. The bulletin board showed a floor plan of the hotel, a simple diagram with rooms marked by number. There were rooms on the ground floor, the first floor, the second floor, and the fourth floor. But the third floor was marked differently. It showed only 2 rooms, 301 and 302, and the rest of the floor was labeled storage. There was no room 308. Sarah felt her stomach twist. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "We're in 308. We have a key for it." Tom pulled the brass tag from his pocket and held it up. The number 308 was clearly stamped into the metal. He looked back at the floor plan, then at Sarah. Maybe this is an old diagram. Maybe they renovated and added more rooms. Sarah wasn't convinced, but before she could respond, they heard footsteps on the stairs behind them. They turned to see an older Thai man descending, wearing slippers and a faded shirt, his hair disheveled as if he'd just woken up. He looked surprised to see them. He spoke in Thai, a rapid question that neither of them understood, and Tom quickly said, "Do you speak English?" The man switched languages, his accent heavy but his words clear enough. "What are you doing down here? It's very late." Sarah stepped forward. "We keep getting phone calls in our room telling us to leave, from a woman who says she's calling from the front desk. But there's no one here, and our phone doesn't even work. Can you explain what's happening?" The man's expression changed. He looked at the key tag in Tom's hand, and something like recognition, or maybe fear, passed across his face. He said, "What room are you in?" Tom held up the key. 308. The man took a step back. He shook his head slowly. "No, that's not possible. Room 308 has been closed for many years. We don't give that room to guests." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Then why did your receptionist give us this key? Why are we staying there right now?" The man looked genuinely distressed. He ran a hand over his face and said, "I am the night manager. There must be some mistake. Who checked you in? What time?" Tom told him about their arrival, about the young woman at the desk, and the man's frown deepened. "There was no one scheduled to work this afternoon. I came on duty at 8, and the desk was empty. I thought perhaps my colleague had left early." He looked at the key again, then up at them. "Please, you must come with me. We will move you to a different room. You cannot stay in 308. He turned and walked toward the stairs, gesturing for them to follow. Sarah and Tom exchanged a glance, both of them unsettled, and then they climbed the stairs together. The night manager led them to the third floor, and as they reached the landing, Sarah noticed something she hadn't seen before. There were only 2 doors, visible on this floor, marked 301 and 302, exactly as the floor plan had shown. The hallway ended in a wall, painted the same faded yellow as the rest of the corridor, with no indication that any other rooms existed beyond. But when they had walked this hallway earlier, when they had unlocked room 308 and gone inside, there had definitely been a door. Sarah remembered it clearly. It had been near the end of the hall, the last door on the right, she pointed. "Our room is down there," she said. The night manager shook his head. "There is nothing down there, only storage. Please, show me your key." Tom handed it to him, and the man examined it closely, turning it over in his hands. His face had gone pale. He walked down the hallway, past the 2 numbered doors, and stopped at the wall. He ran his hand along the painted surface, then turned to look at them. "Where do you think the door is?" Sarah walked up beside him and pointed. "Right here. This is where we came in." The night manager pressed, his palm against the wall where she indicated. It was solid. No seam, no frame, no handle, just smooth plaster. He turned to them, his voice low and urgent. "Listen to me carefully. Many years ago, there was a room 308. A guest stayed there, a young woman traveling alone. She called the front desk in the middle of the night, many times asking for help. She said someone was in her room. She said she was afraid. But when the staff went to check, they found the door locked from the inside and she would not answer. They had to break the door down. By then it was too late. She had taken her own life. After that, the room was closed. The door was removed. The space was sealed. But sometimes guests report staying there. They find a key. They find a door, and they receive calls warning them to leave. The calls come from the phone in that room, but the line was disconnected years ago. No one knows how it's possible." Sarah felt the floor tilt beneath her. She reached out and grabbed Tom's arm for support. "That's insane," Tom said, his voice tight. "We were in that room. We slept there." The night manager looked at them with something like pity. "Then you are very fortunate to be standing here now. Not everyone who stays in room 308 leaves." He gestured back toward the stairs. "Please, come. I will give you a different room, and we will not charge you for tonight. You must not go back there." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted proof, wanted anything that would make this make sense. But the memory of that voice on the phone, the urgency and fear in it, the way it had said you need to leave before it's too late, all of it coalesced into a cold certainty in her chest. She looked at Tom and saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. They followed the night manager downstairs. He gave them a new key for room 201 and helped them carry their bags, which had somehow appeared in the lobby, though neither of them remembered bringing them down. As they climbed the stairs to the second floor, Sarah glanced back at the third-floor landing. For just a moment, in the dim light, she thought she saw a door at the end of the hallway. A door marked 308, slightly ajar, with darkness beyond. But when she blinked, it was gone, and there was only the yellow wall, blank and silent. They didn't sleep for the rest of the night. They sat in room 201 with all the lights on, talking in whispers, trying to process what had happened. In the morning they checked out, cutting their stay short, and the young woman from the afternoon before was at the desk. She smiled at them and asked if everything had been satisfactory. Tom asked her why she had given them the key to room 308. The woman's smile faded. She looked confused. "I gave you room 201, she said. "That's what's in our system. See?" She turned the computer screen toward them, and sure enough, the reservation showed room 201. The key tag for 308 that Tom had placed on the counter was gone. In its place was the tag for 201. Sarah and Tom left the Lotus Garden Hotel without another word. They never spoke about it with anyone else, and they never returned to Chiang Mai. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah would wake from dreams she couldn't quite remember, and in the darkness she would hear the faint, impossible sound of a phone ringing. A phone that shouldn't be connected, in a room that shouldn't exist, carrying a warning from someone who died years ago. And she would lie there, listening, grateful beyond measure that she had answered, grateful that she had left when the voice told her to. Because some warnings, no matter how impossible they seem, are not meant to be ignored. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. These first two stories have shown us how the places we consider safe, the hotels we trust, the elevators we ride without a second thought, can become doorways to something far darker. But as disturbing as these encounters were, they are only the beginning. In the next part, we will venture deeper into the shadows of Asia, where the horror becomes more personal, more intimate, and far more difficult to escape. Because sometimes the terror doesn't wait in sealed rooms or impossible floors. Sometimes it follows you home, wears a familiar face, and refuses to let go. What comes next will test the very limits of what we believe is possible. The mirror was the first thing Kenji Tanaka noticed when he entered the room, not because it was particularly large or ornate, but because someone had gone to great lengths to hide it. A white cloth had been draped over the entire surface, pinned carefully at the corners and hanging straight to the floor, transforming what should have been a decorative piece into something that resembled a shrouded corpse. Kenji stood in the doorway of his room at the Kaminari Ryokan, his overnight bag still in his hand, and stared at the covered mirror. It was positioned on the far wall, between two sliding paper doors that led to a small private garden. The cloth was pristine, almost glowing in the afternoon light that filtered through the shoji screens, and there was something about its deliberate concealment that made Kenji's skin prickle with unease. He set his bag down and approached it slowly, reaching out to touch the fabric. It was silk, cool and smooth under his fingers, and when he lifted the edge slightly, he could see the dark wood of the mirror's frame underneath. He let the cloth fall back into place and stepped away, telling himself it was just a cultural practice he didn't understand, something to do with feng shui or traditional beliefs about reflections and spirits. But the feeling of wrongness persisted, a quiet insistence at the back of his mind that the mirror had been covered for a reason, and that reason had nothing to do with decoration. Kenji was 32 years old, a photographer based in Tokyo who specialized in architectural and landscape work for travel magazines and corporate clients. He had been on assignment in the Gifu prefecture for 3 days, documenting a series of historic villages for a tourism campaign, and the Kaminari Ryokan had been recommended to him by his liaison from the local tourism board. It was a traditional inn that had been in operation for over 200 years, she had told him, tucked into the mountains far from the major tourist routes, known primarily to locals and a handful of international travelers who sought authentic experiences away from the crowds. The photographs she had shown him were beautiful, all dark wood and stone gardens and rooms with tatami floors that looked out onto forested hills. Kenji had booked 2 nights, planning to use the ryokan as a base while he explored the surrounding area. The drive up had been longer than he expected, winding through narrow mountain roads that seemed to climb endlessly into the mist, and by the time he arrived it was late afternoon. The ryokan was exactly as the photographs had depicted, a low wooden structure with a traditional curved roof, surrounded by carefully maintained gardens and the sound of running water from hidden streams. An elderly woman had greeted him at the entrance, bowing deeply and welcoming him in formal Japanese that made Kenji feel as though he had stepped back in time. She had introduced herself as Nakamura-san, the proprietor, and she had led him through corridors that smelled of cedar and incense to this room on the second floor. The room itself was simple and elegant, with tatami mats covering the floor, a low table in the center, and futons folded neatly in a closet that would be laid out later for sleeping. Everything was exactly as he had hoped, except for the mirror. After Nakamura-san had left him alone, explaining that dinner would be served in the communal dining room at 7, Kenji unpacked his camera equipment and reviewed the shots he had taken that morning. But his attention kept drifting back to the covered mirror. It bothered him, that deliberate concealment, and the more he tried to ignore it, the more it occupied his thoughts. Finally, around 5 in the evening, he stood up and walked over to it. The cloth was secured with small pins that were nearly invisible against the white fabric, and Kenji carefully removed them one by one, placing them on the windowsill beside him. The silk came away easily once the pins were gone, sliding off the mirror's surface and pooling on the floor. Kenji folded it automatically, his hands moving through the familiar motions while his eyes fixed on what had been revealed. The mirror was old, its frame carved from dark wood that had been polished until it gleamed, decorated with intricate patterns of waves and chrysanthemums. The glass itself was large, perhaps 5 feet tall and 3 feet wide, and it reflected the room with perfect clarity. Kenji saw himself standing before it, saw the afternoon light on his face, saw the garden visible through the doors behind him. Everything looked normal, ordinary. He reached out and touched the glass, half expecting it to be cold, but it was room temperature, smooth and clean beneath his fingertips. He felt foolish for his earlier unease. It was just a mirror. Someone had probably covered it to protect it during cleaning, or perhaps there was a superstition he didn't know about. He left the cloth folded on the floor and returned to his work, downloading photographs onto his laptop and making notes for the next day's shooting schedule. It was almost an hour later when Kenji glanced up from his computer and saw the mirror again, and this time something was different. His reflection was smiling. Kenji froze, his fingers motionless on the keyboard, and stared at the image in the glass. He was not smiling. His face was neutral, perhaps slightly tired, his lips pressed together in the unconscious expression he always wore when concentrating. But the reflection showed something else entirely. The face in the mirror wore a wide, pleased smile, the kind of expression Kenji might wear when seeing an old friend or receiving good news. Except there was something wrong with it. The smile was too broad, stretching the face in a way that looked almost painful, and the eyes above it were not happy. They were intent, focused, staring directly out of the mirror at him with an intensity that made Kenji's breath catch in his throat. He blinked, certain it was a trick of the light, a momentary illusion caused by fatigue or the angle of the sundae. But when he opened his eyes, the reflection was still smiling, still staring, while Kenji himself remained frozen in shock. Slowly, carefully, Kenji raised his hand to his own face, touching his lips to confirm they were not curved upward. They weren't. His fingers felt the straight line of his mouth, the tension in his jaw. But in the mirror, the reflection's hand did not move. It simply continued to smile, hands resting on the laptop keyboard, mimicking Kenji's posture from moments before. Then the reflection's smile widened further, impossibly wide, and Kenji saw his own teeth bared in an expression that was no longer anything close to human. Kenji shoved his chair backwards so violently it toppled over, the crash echoing through the quiet room. He scrambled to his feet and backed away from the mirror, his heart hammering against his ribs, unable to look away from the thing wearing his face. The reflection didn't move. It sat there in the chair that Kenji had just vacated, still smiling that horrible stretched smile, still staring. Kenji could see every detail of the room behind the reflection, the tatami mats and the paper doors and the garden beyond, all perfectly rendered, all exactly as they should be, except for the figure that was supposed to be him. He stood there for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, frozen between flight and the impossible need to understand what he was seeing. Then, slowly, the reflection began to change. The smile faded, degree by degree, until the face in the mirror wore the same expression of horror that Kenji knew was on his own face. The reflection lifted one hand and pressed it against the glass from the inside, and Kenji could see the palm flatten against the surface, could see the fingers spread wide. It was reaching toward him. Kenji didn't think. He grabbed the white cloth from where he had left. It folded on the floor and threw it over the mirror, covering the surface in one frantic motion. The cloth fell into place, obscuring the glass completely, and Kenji stood there breathing hard, his hands shaking. The room was silent. Nothing moved. Kenji waited, listening. But there was no sound except his own ragged breathing and the faint rustle of wind through the garden outside. Then he heard the knocking. It was soft, at first, barely audible, a gentle tapping that seemed to come from the direction of the mirror. Kenji took a step back, his eyes fixed on the white cloth. The knocking came again, louder this time, a deliberate rhythm. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps, pause. It sounded like knuckles on wood or perhaps on glass, coming from somewhere behind the cloth. Kenji's rational mind tried to supply explanations. The old building settling, pipes in the walls, something outside the window. But he knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic entirely, that the sound was coming from inside the mirror, from whatever was on the other side of that glass, wearing his face, reaching toward him. The knocking continued, patient and persistent, and Kenji backed toward the door. He needed to leave this room. He needed to talk to Nakamura-san, to ask her what the hell this mirror was and why it had been covered. His hand was on the door handle when he heard footsteps in the corridor outside, slow, shuffling, footsteps that stopped just beyond his door. There was a soft knock, nothing like the insistent tapping from the mirror, and then Nakamura-san's voice, quiet and concerned. "Tanaka-san? Is everything all right?" I heard a noise. Kenji wrenched the door open. The elderly woman stood in the hallway, her face creased with worry. Kenji realized he must look wild. His hair disheveled, his breathing still unsteady. "The mirror," he said, his voice coming out hoarse. "Something's wrong with the mirror." I uncovered it, and he stopped, unsure how to explain what he had seen. Nakamura-san's expression changed. The worry drained away, replaced by something that looked like resignation, or perhaps sorrow. She looked past him into the room, at the covered mirror on the far wall, and let out a long, slow breath. "You uncovered it," she said. It was not a question. Kenji nodded, and Nakamura-san closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, she looked older, more tired. "You shouldn't have looked," she said quietly. "The mirror has been covered for 20 years. We do not allow guests in this room anymore, but there was a mistake with the booking system. I am very sorry. You must leave this room immediately." Kenji's mind was racing. "What do you mean? What is that thing? Why is it in your inn?" Nakamura-san stepped into the room, giving the mirror a wide berth, and began gathering Kenji's belongings with efficient movements. "I will explain later," she said. "But now we must move you. The mirror cannot be uncovered. It should never have been uncovered. please, come with me." She gestured toward the hallway, and Kenji followed her, casting one last glance back at the covered mirror. The knocking had stopped. The room was silent again, but Kenji could feel something watching him from behind that white cloth, something that knew his face, that had worn his smile like a mask. Nakamura-san led him to a different room on the first floor, smaller than the previous one, but with no mirror at all, just a simple space with tatami and a window overlooking a stone garden. She set his things down and turned to face him, her hands folded in front of her. 20 years ago, she began, her voice low. A young man stayed in that room. He was traveling alone, researching local folklore for a book. He was very interested in the stories of this area, the old superstitions. One night he uncovered the mirror, just as you did. We found him the next morning. He was sitting in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection, and he would not move. He would not speak. His eyes were open, but he did not see us. We had to call for help to take him away. The doctors said it was a kind of catatonia, a complete break from reality, but he never recovered. He lives in a facility now, still staring at nothing, still silent. Kenji felt his skin go cold. What happened to him? What did he see? Nakamura-san shook her head slowly. We do not know exactly, but the mirror has been here much longer than this inn. It came with the building when my grandfather purchased the property, already covered, already sealed. There were warnings passed down, instructions never to remove the cloth, never to look into the glass. My grandfather kept those rules. So did my father. But when I took over the inn, I thought perhaps the stories were just superstition. I uncovered the mirror once, many years before the young man came, just for a moment, just to clean. She paused, and Kenji saw her hands trembling slightly. I saw myself, she continued, but older, much older, dying, lying in a bed, alone, in terrible pain. And the reflection, it saw me too. It smiled, and I knew somehow that it was showing me my future. Not a possible future, but the certain one, the one that would come to pass. I covered the mirror immediately, and I have never looked again. But sometimes, at night, I hear the knocking. I think it is still there, on the other side, waiting for someone to look, waiting to show them what they will become or what might take their place. Kenji's mouth was dry. The reflection I saw, it was smiling before I smiled. It moved differently than I did. Nakamura-san nodded. The mirror does not show what is. It shows what could be, what wants to be. There are stories in this region, very old stories, about portals between worlds, places where the boundary is thin, where things can pass through if given the chance. That mirror is one of those places, and you gave it a chance when you looked. You showed it your face, your form. Now it knows you. Kenji felt sick. What does that mean? What's going to happen? The old woman placed a hand on his shoulder, and her grip was surprisingly strong. You must not look into the mirror again. Not tonight. Not ever. If you see your reflection in any glass, any surface, you must look away immediately if it moves wrong. If it smiles when you do not smile. If it reaches when you do not reach. Because now it knows how to find you, and it will try. Kenji spent that night in the new room, but he did not sleep. He lay on the futon with all the lights on, listening to the sounds of the old building settling around him, flinching at every creak and whisper. He thought about packing his things and leaving immediately, driving back down the mountain in the dark, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was pride, or stubbornness, or the simple fact that he didn't believe leaving would make any difference. If what Nakamura-san said was true, If the thing in the mirror now knew him, then distance wouldn't matter. It would find him wherever he went, waiting in reflections, watching from behind glass. The night passed with agonizing slowness. Kenji avoided looking at the window, at the screen of his turned-off phone, at anything that might cast back his image. When morning finally came, he packed his equipment and checked out, declining Nakamura-san's offer of breakfast. She stood at the entrance and watched him load his car, her expression unreadable. "Be careful, Tanaka-san," she said as he prepared to drive away. "If you see it again, do not acknowledge it. Do not let it know you can see. Sometimes, if you ignore them long enough, these things lose interest." Kenji nodded, though he didn't believe her, and drove down the mountain as the sun rose over the forest. He finished his assignment in the following days, working mechanically, avoiding mirrors, turning his camera away from reflective surfaces, but he couldn't escape entirely. In shop windows, in the glass doors of restaurants, in the rearview mirror of his car, he would sometimes catch a glimpse of movement that didn't match his own. A smile that appeared fractionally too soon. Eyes that lingered when his had already looked away. It was subtle, easy to dismiss as paranoia or imagination, but Kenji knew better. The thing from the mirror was learning his movements, his expressions, the way he inhabited his own body. And with each passing day, each stolen glance in reflective surfaces, it was getting better at pretending to be him. 3 weeks after leaving the Kaminari Ryokan, Kenji was in his apartment in Tokyo, editing photographs late into the night, when he decided to take a break. He stood up from his desk and stretched, and without thinking, he glanced at the mirror hanging on his bedroom wall. His reflection stood in the doorway, exactly where he was standing, matching his posture perfectly. Then it smiled. Not his smile, not the expression he would have made, but that same too-wide grin he had seen in the ryokan, the one that stretched the face into something inhuman. Kenji's blood turned to ice. The reflection stepped forward, moving through the doorway in the mirror, even though Kenji himself had not moved. It approached the glass from the inside, coming closer and closer until its face filled the entire surface of the mirror, still smiling, still staring with those intent, hungry eyes. Kenji stumbled backward, his mind screaming at him to run, to cover the mirror, to do something, but his body wouldn't obey. The reflection pressed both hands against the glass, and Kenji heard a sound like cracking ice, like something beginning to break. The surface of the mirror rippled, warping and bending, and the reflection's hands began to push through, not breaking the glass, but passing through it, fingers emerging into the real world, reaching for him. Kenji finally found his voice and screamed. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy bookend from his desk, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered with a sound like a gunshot, fragments exploding outward and falling to the floor in a glittering cascade. The hands disappeared. The reflection was gone. Kenji stood there, breathing hard, surrounded by broken glass, and realized he was crying. He never hung another mirror in his apartment. He covered the bathroom mirror with newspaper and learned to shave by touch. He avoided reflective surfaces obsessively, taking the frowned stairs instead of the elevator with its mirrored walls, shopping only in stores without glass displays. His friends noticed the change, the way he would turn away from windows, the way he never quite looked at them when they spoke, but he couldn't explain. How could he tell them that somewhere, in the shattered fragments of mirrors, in the dark glass of turned-off screens, something was waiting, something that wore his face and knew his name and was learning, piece by piece, how to take his place. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But mirrors are not the only surfaces that can betray us, not the only boundaries between our world and something else. Sometimes the horror comes from places far more mundane, from the things we take for granted in our daily lives. Water, for instance, the water we drink, the water we bathe in, the water that flows through pipes hidden in walls we never see. In China, in a hotel room overlooking a city that never sleeps, a traveler made a discovery that would change the way he thought about the infrastructure we trust without question. This is the story of Room 912 and the water that should never have been used. The smell hit David Wu the moment he opened the bathroom door, a metallic tang that reminded him of blood or rust, sharp enough to make him wrinkle his nose in disgust. He flipped on the light and examined the small bathroom, searching for the source. Everything looked clean, the white tiles gleaming under the fluorescent bulbs, the toilet spotless, the shower stall empty except for a small bottle of complimentary shampoo. But the smell persisted, stronger now, emanating from the sink. David turned on the tap and watched the water flow, clear and normal in appearance. But when he held his hand under the stream, he felt it, that slick, unpleasant texture that water shouldn't have, and the smell intensified until he had to step back. He turned off the tap quickly and stood there, staring at the sink, wondering what kind of plumbing issue could produce water that smelled like metal and felt like oil. He made a mental note to call the front desk in the morning and request a different room, then return to the main room to unpack. It was late, nearly midnight, and he was too exhausted from travel to deal with hotel maintenance tonight. The smell was unpleasant but not unbearable, and as long as he kept the bathroom door closed, he could ignore it until morning. David was a 35-year-old software engineer from San Francisco, in Chongqing for a week-long business conference. His company was expanding its operations into mainland China, and David, fluent in Mandarin thanks to his parents, had been chosen to represent the technical team at a series of meetings with potential partners. He had arrived that evening, after a 13-hour flight and 2 hours navigating the chaos of the airport and finding a taxi. The Grand Dynasty Hotel was one of those massive modern towers that seemed to dominate Chinese cities, 40 floors of glass and steel overlooking the Jieling River, with a lobby so vast and impersonal that David had felt like an ant crossing its polished expanse. Check-in had been efficient, handled by a young woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes, and David had been too tired to pay much attention to the room number on his keycard, 912. 9th floor, Riverview, queen bed. It was functional, anonymous, exactly what he needed. The room itself was standard for this kind of hotel. A comfortable bed with white linens, a desk with a lamp and phone, a flat-screen television mounted on the wall, and a window with heavy curtains that blocked out the city lights. David had checked his email, sent a quick message to his wife letting her know he had arrived safely and was preparing for bed when he'd noticed the smell. Now, lying in the dark with the bathroom door firmly closed, he could still detect faint traces of it seeping through the gap at the bottom of the door. He told himself it was just old pipes, mineral deposits, something easily explained and easily fixed. But sleep was slow to come, and when it finally did, his dreams were filled with the sound of running water and the taste of metal on his tongue. Morning brought no improvement. David showered in water that smelled even worse when heated, the steam filling the bathroom with that blood rust odor until he could barely breathe. He brushed his teeth using bottled water he'd bought from a convenience store the night before, and made a point of calling the front desk before leaving for his first meeting. The man who answered spoke English with a heavy accent, and David explained the problem as clearly as he could. The water in his room smelled strange, metallic, possibly contaminated. Could someone check the plumbing? There was a pause on the other end of the line. then a cheerful assurance that maintenance would look into it immediately. David thanked him and left for the day, grateful to escape the room and its unsettling smell. The conference occupied most of his attention for the next several hours: presentations and networking, and the careful dance of international business relationships. But in the back of his mind, David kept thinking about that water, the way it had felt slick against his skin, the way the smell had seemed to cling to him even after he'd dried off. When he returned to the hotel that evening, exhausted and ready to collapse, he found a small note slipped under his door. The message was brief, printed in both Chinese and English. "Dear guest, our maintenance team has inspected the plumbing in your room and found no issues. The water is safe and meets all quality standards. If you have further concerns, please contact the front desk. We apologize for any inconvenience." David crumpled the note in his fist. He walked to the bathroom, turned on the tap, and the same metallic smell billowed out, stronger than before. "Safe," the note had said. "Meets all quality standards." He filled a glass with tap water and held it up to the light. It looked clear, normal, but when he brought it close to his face, the smell made his eyes water. He poured it down the sink and grabbed his phone. The front desk answered on the third ring, and this time, David's tone was less polite. He explained that the problem had not been fixed, that the water still smelled terrible, and that he wanted to be moved to a different room immediately. The voice on the other end, a different person from the morning, apologized profusely and put him on hold. David waited, listening to tinny elevator music, and stared at the bathroom. He could see the sink from where he stood, the tap still dripping slightly, each drop hitting the basin with a soft, plinking sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. The music cut off, and the voice returned. "I am very sorry, sir, but we are fully booked tonight. I can offer you a room change tomorrow, or if you prefer, a complimentary upgrade when one becomes available. Would that be acceptable?" David wanted to argue, wanted to demand they find him a room in a different hotel entirely, but he was too tired. He agreed to the room change for the following day and hung up, then stood there in the middle of the room, feeling frustrated and uneasy. It was just water. Bad plumbing, mineral deposits, something wrong with the pipes. Nothing dangerous. He could survive one more night. He ordered room service for dinner, avoiding the bathroom as much as possible, and tried to focus on work emails. But as the evening wore on, the smell seemed to intensify. It was no longer confined to the bathroom. David could smell it in the main room now. A faint but persistent odor that reminded him of old pennies and something organic, something rotting. He opened the window, letting in the noise of the city below, but the smell remained. Around 10 o'clock, unable to concentrate, David decided to investigate further. He returned to the bathroom and examined the sink more carefully, running his fingers around the drain, checking for blockages or buildup. Nothing seemed unusual. The pipes looked new. The fixtures were clean. He tried the shower, and the water that came out was the same, clear to the eye but wrong in every other way. Then he looked up at the ceiling and noticed something he hadn't seen before. There was a small access panel in the ceiling above the shower, partially concealed by the overhead light fixture. It was the kind of panel that would provide access to pipes and wiring, standard in most hotels, but something about it caught David's attention. The edges were slightly darker than the surrounding ceiling, as if moisture had seeped through and stained the paint. David dragged the desk chair into the bathroom, climbed up carefully, and examined the panel more closely. The staining was more pronounced than he'd thought, a yellowing discoloration that spread out from the edges of the panel in irregular patterns. He pressed his hand against the ceiling and felt dampness, the paint soft and spongy under his fingers. Something was leaking behind that panel, and it had been leaking for a while. David knew he should call maintenance again, should insist they come immediately to check this, but curiosity got the better of him. He pushed at the panel, and it lifted easily, sliding to the side with a scraping sound. Darkness gaped above him, and a smell rolled out that was so overpowering David nearly fell off the chair. It was the same metallic odor from the tap, but magnified 100 times, mixed with something else now, something putrid and foul that made him gag. He fumbled for his phone, turned on its flashlight, and shone it up into the gap. What he saw made his blood run cold. There was a water tank in the ceiling, a large plastic cistern that fed the bathroom below, and floating in that water, pressed against the inside of the translucent plastic so that he could see her silhouette clearly, was a body. A woman, her long, dark hair spread out around her head like seaweed, her pale limbs suspended in the cloudy liquid. David made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and dropped the phone. It clattered into the shower stall below, its lights spinning wildly, and David climbed down from the chair so fast he nearly twisted his ankle. He was in the hallway seconds later, pounding on the door of the neighboring room, shouting for help. No one answered. He ran to the elevator, jabbed the button for the lobby, and rode down in a state of near panic, his mind refusing to fully process what he had seen. There was a body in the water tank. In his water tank. The water he had showered in. The water he had used to wash his face and hands. The lobby was nearly empty at this hour. Just a single clerk behind the desk, and a security guard standing near the entrance. David ran to the desk, his words tumbling out in a frantic mix of English and Mandarin. Room 912, water tank, body, dead woman, need to call police. The clerk's expression shifted from polite attention to alarm, and she picked up the phone immediately, speaking rapidly in Mandarin to someone on the other end. The security guard approached, asking David to calm down, to explain slowly what he had seen. David tried, but his hands were shaking, and he could still smell that horrible odor, could still see that silhouette floating in the cloudy water. Within minutes, more staff appeared, including a manager in a dark suit who listened to David's account with a face that grew progressively paler. Police were called. David was asked to sit in the lobby while they went to investigate. He sat there for what felt like hours but was probably less than 30 minutes, watching hotel, staff, and then uniformed police officers enter the elevator and disappear upward. When they finally came back down, one of the officers approached him and asked him to come to the station to give a statement. David went, numb and disoriented, and spent the rest of the night in a fluorescent-lit room answering questions. The story emerged slowly, pieced together from police records and reluctant admissions from the hotel management. Room 912 had been occupied 3 months earlier by a woman traveling alone, a graduate student from Beijing conducting research in Chongqing. She had checked in for a week-long stay and had been described by staff as quiet, keeping to herself, rarely leaving her room. On the 4th day of her stay, housekeeping had found the room empty and undisturbed. The woman's belongings still in place, but the guest herself nowhere to be found. The hotel had assumed she had simply gone out early, but she never returned. Her keycard was never used again. Her belongings remained in the room for days before the hotel finally contacted the police and reported her missing. A search had been conducted, but the woman had simply vanished. No one had thought to check the ceiling. No one had checked the water tank that served rooms on the 9th and 10th floors. The woman had somehow accessed the roof, climbed into the tank, and drowned. Whether it was suicide or an accident remained unclear. What was clear was that her body had been floating in that tank for 3 months, decomposing slowly, her hair clogging the pipes, her presence contaminating the water that flowed into the rooms below. The hotel, David learned later, had known something was wrong. Guests in rooms on those floors had complained repeatedly about the water, about the smell and the discoloration. The hotel had sent maintenance to check the pipes, had assured everyone the water was safe, but they had never looked in the tank itself. Or perhaps, David thought darkly, they had looked and chosen not to report it, chosen to keep the hotel running rather than face the scandal and the lawsuits. He would never know for certain. The hotel moved him to a different property immediately, covered all his expenses, begged him not to speak to the press. David agreed, not out of kindness, but out of exhaustion, out of a desperate desire to forget what he had seen. He flew back to San Francisco 2 days later, cutting his trip short, claiming a family emergency. For weeks afterward, he couldn't bring himself to drink tap water, couldn't shower without thinking about that silhouette in the tank, that long, dark hair spreading through the pipes like roots. He would stand at the sink in his own home, watching water flow from the faucet, and wonder what was really in it, what might be floating in the tanks and reservoirs and treatment plants that fed the infrastructure everyone took for granted. His wife noticed the change, the way he bought cases of bottled water, the way he would sometimes stand in the bathroom doorway just staring at the ceiling. He told her eventually, told her everything, and she held him while he described the smell and the sight of that body suspended in cloudy water. She suggested therapy. He went, talked to someone about trauma and intrusive thoughts and the challenge of trusting the world again. But some things, David knew, couldn't be fixed with talking. Some images, once seen, couldn't be unseen. And sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet and he could hear water running through pipes hidden in the walls, David would remember room 912. He would remember the metallic smell and the slick texture and the way the hotel staff had insisted everything was safe, meets all quality standards, nothing to worry about. He would remember, and he would wonder how many other rooms, how many other hotels, how many other towers of glass and steel built too fast and managed too carelessly might be hiding their own terrible secrets in the dark spaces between floors, in the water tanks no one bothers to check, in the infrastructure we trust blindly because we have to, because the alternative is too terrifying to consider. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The stories we've shared so far have all involved places, spaces where travelers ventured and found horror waiting in rooms and reflections and water that should have been clean. But the final 2 stories are different. They are quieter in their terror, more intimate in their scope. They are not about chance encounters in strange locations, but about the horror that follows people home, that embeds itself in their lives so deeply that escape becomes impossible. These last 2 tales will take us to places where the boundaries between the living and something else grow thin, where the rules we thought governed reality begin to bend and break. What comes next are the stories that will stay with you longest, the ones that make you question what you see in the corners of your vision, the ones that remind you that sometimes the most terrifying thing is not what we encounter in distant hotels, but what we bring back with us, unknowing, into the safety of our own homes. The knock came at 3:17 in the morning, soft but deliberate, 3 taps against the wall that separated Claire's room from the one next door. She woke instantly, her eyes opening in the darkness, her body tense as she listened. The knock came again, the same rhythm, patient and measured, as if whoever was on the other side knew she was awake and waiting. Claire sat up slowly, her heart beating faster than it should, and stared at the wall. The room next to hers was supposed to be empty. She had asked at check-in, specifically requested a quiet floor with minimal neighbors, and the receptionist had assured her that the rooms on either side were vacant. Claire was a light sleeper, sensitive to noise, and she had learned over years of business travel to verify these details before accepting a room key. But now someone was knocking, and the sound was too close, too intimate, as if the person on the other side was pressing their knuckles directly against the thin barrier that separated them. Claire reached for her phone on the nightstand, checked the time, and considered calling the front desk. But what would she say? Someone knocked on the wall? It sounded paranoid, irrational. Maybe another guest had checked in late. Maybe the receptionist had made a mistake. Claire lay back down, pulling the covers up to her chin, and tried to ignore it. The knocking stopped. Silence returned, thick and oppressive, and Claire closed her eyes. Then she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth, like someone waiting. Claire Lim was 31 years old, a marketing consultant based in Kuala Lumpur who traveled frequently for work. She had stayed in dozens of hotels across Malaysia and beyond, always alone, always efficient, moving through airports and conference rooms and anonymous hotel corridors with the practiced ease of someone who had made solitude a profession. This particular trip had brought her to Penang for a 3-day conference, and she had chosen the Meridian Suites because of its reputation for quiet professionalism and its location near the convention center. The hotel was mid-range, modern but not luxurious, with clean lines and minimal decoration that suited Claire's preferences perfectly. She had arrived late in the afternoon, checked in without incident, and spent the evening reviewing presentation notes in her room. The room itself was unremarkable, a standard layout with a queen bed, a desk, a small bathroom, and a window that overlooked the city lights. There were 2 doors visible from her bed, one leading to the hallway and one to the bathroom, and the wall to her right separated her from room 504, which the receptionist had confirmed was unoccupied. Claire had gone to bed around 11, exhausted from the drive and the preparations for tomorrow's meetings, and had fallen asleep easily until the knocking woke her. Now, lying in the darkness and listening to those footsteps pace outside her door, Claire felt a crawling unease that she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the noise. It was the feeling that accompanied it, the sense that whoever was out there knew exactly which room she was in, knew she was awake, and was waiting for something. Claire got out of bed, moved quietly to the door, and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty, lit by the dim emergency lighting that created long shadows along the carpet. No one was there, but she could still hear the footsteps, faint now, moving away toward the elevator. Claire waited until the sound faded completely, then returned to bed. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Claire was exhausted, her head foggy, and her nerves frayed. She attended the conference sessions mechanically, barely absorbing the information, and returned to the hotel in the early evening with a splitting headache. She stopped at the front desk on her way to the elevator, waited for the clerk to finish with another guest, and then asked about the room next to hers. The clerk, a young man with a polite smile, checked his computer and confirmed that room 504 was indeed vacant, had been vacant for the past week. Claire hesitated, unsure how to phrase her concern without sounding irrational. She finally said that she had heard noises during the night, knocking and footsteps, and wondered if perhaps maintenance had been working in that area. The clerk frowned and checked his system again. No maintenance was scheduled for that floor, he said. Would she like to file a noise complaint? Claire shook her head, thanked him, and took the elevator up to the 5th floor. As she walked down the hallway toward her room, she paused in front of 504. The door was identical to all the others, plain and featureless, with a card reader and a small brass number plate. Claire pressed her ear against it, listening, but heard nothing. The door was cold against her skin. She pulled away and continued to her own room, unlocked it, and went inside. Everything was as she had left it. Her laptop on the desk, her suitcase by the closet, the bed made by housekeeping. Claire dropped her bag on the chair and walked to the wall that separated her room from 504. She pressed her palm against it, feeling the smooth painted surface, and knocked once, experimentally. The sound was dull, absorbed by insulation and drywall. She waited, but there was no response. Claire shook her head at her own foolishness and went to take a shower, trying to wash away the fatigue and the lingering unease from the night before. The knocking returned at 3:19 in the morning, the same soft, deliberate rhythm, and this time Claire was ready. She had gone to bed fully dressed, her phone in her hand, and the moment she heard the sound, she was out of bed and moving toward the door. She didn't turn on the lights. She moved through the darkness to the door, looked through the peephole, and saw the empty hallway exactly as before. But the knocking continued, and now she realized with creeping horror that it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside the wall, from the space between her room and 504, as if someone was standing in that impossible gap and tapping against the barrier from within. Claire pressed her ear against the wall, her breath shallow, and heard something else beneath the knocking. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing, perfectly synchronized with the knocks. 3 taps, 3 breaths. 3 taps, 3 breaths. Claire stumbled backward, her skin crawling, and grabbed her phone. She dialed the front desk, and when the same polite clerk answered, she demanded that someone come to the 5th floor immediately, that someone check room 504, because there was definitely someone in there. The clerk tried to calm her, assured her that no one had checked into that room, but Claire interrupted him. "I don't care what your system says," she said, her voice tight. "Someone is in there and they're knocking on my wall. Please send security." The clerk agreed, said someone would be there in a few minutes, and Claire hung up. She stood in the middle of her room, arms wrapped around herself, listening. The knocking had stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, heavy with anticipation. Then she heard the sound of a keycard sliding into a lock, the soft beep of a door opening, and footsteps entering the room next door. Claire's blood ran cold. She moved to the wall and pressed her ear against it again, barely breathing. The footsteps moved through 504, slow and purposeful, and then stopped directly on the other side of the wall where Claire was standing. She could hear breathing again, closer now, separated from her by only inches of drywall. Then a voice, soft and feminine, speaking so quietly that Claire had to strain to hear it. "Your turn," the voice said. Claire jerked away from the wall as if it had burned her. She ran to the door, wrenched it open, and stumbled into the hallway. The door to 504 was closed, its surface smooth and undisturbed, but as Claire stood there staring at it, she saw the handle turn. Slowly, deliberately, the handle rotated downward, and the door began to open. Claire didn't wait to see what came out. She ran down the hallway toward the elevator, her bare feet silent on the carpet, and jabbed the call button repeatedly. Behind her, she heard the door to 504 open fully, heard footsteps enter the hallway, but she didn't turn around. The elevator chimed, and the doors opened, and Claire threw herself inside, hitting the button for the lobby. As the doors began to close, she finally looked back down the hallway. A figure stood outside room 504, silhouetted against the dim emergency lighting. It was a woman, or something shaped like a woman, with long dark hair that hung past her shoulders and obscured her face. She stood perfectly still, facing the elevator, and even from this distance, Claire could feel the weight of her gaze. The elevator doors closed, and Claire slumped against the wall, shaking. When she reached the lobby, she found the night clerk already on the phone, presumably calling security, and Claire told him everything in a rush of words that sounded hysterical even to her own ears. The clerk listened with growing concern, then asked her to wait while security checked the 5th floor. Claire sat in the lobby for 20 minutes, watching the elevator doors, until 2 security guards returned and spoke quietly with the clerk. They had checked room 504, they said. The door was locked. The room was empty, and there was no evidence anyone had been inside. The keycard system showed no access to that room for over a week. One of the guards approached Claire and asked her gently if she might have been dreaming, if perhaps the stress of travel and work had caused a kind of waking nightmare. Claire wanted to scream at him that she had been fully awake, that she had heard and seen everything clearly, but she could see in his expression that he didn't believe her. No one believed her. The hotel offered to move her to a different room, a different floor, but Claire refused. She checked out immediately, at 4 a.m, and found a different hotel across the city. She didn't tell the clerk why she was leaving, didn't try to explain the impossible thing she had experienced, because she knew how it would sound. Crazy, irrational. A woman traveling alone, stressed and exhausted, imagining things in the middle of the night. But Claire knew what she had heard. She knew what she had seen. And more than that, she knew what those words had meant. Your turn. As if whatever occupied room 504 had been waiting for Claire specifically, as if the knocking and the footsteps and the opening door had all been leading to some kind of exchange, some crossing over that Claire had narrowly avoided by running. She spent the rest of the night in the new hotel, sitting in a chair with all the lights on, too afraid to sleep. When morning came, she attended the final day of the conference, presented her findings with a professionalism that felt like a mask, and drove back to Kuala Lumpur as soon as the sessions ended. She never returned to Penang. She never stayed at the Meridian Suites again. But sometimes, late at night in her own apartment, Claire would wake to the sound of soft knocking, 3 taps, patient and deliberate, coming from the wall beside her bed, and she would lie there in the darkness, frozen, waiting for the voice that would eventually whisper, "Your turn." Because some invitations, once extended, are never truly withdrawn. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. And some guests check into hotels not as travelers passing through, but as permanent residents waiting for the living to take their place. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The encounters we've shared tonight have all involved moments of terror that arrived suddenly, warnings that came too late, presences that revealed themselves only when escape became impossible. But this final story is different in one crucial way. It begins not with fear, but with kindness, with a helpful gesture from a stranger who seemed too good to be true. Sometimes the most dangerous hauntings are the ones that start with a smile, because they make us forget that not everyone who offers assistance is actually alive. This is the story of the bellboy who wouldn't leave, and the traveler who finally understood why hotels always feel like they're caught between 2 worlds. The bellboy appeared at exactly the moment Daniel Coe needed help, emerging from the shadows of the hotel lobby with a professional smile and an outstretched hand. Daniel had been struggling with his luggage, 2 heavy suitcases and a backpack that kept sliding off his shoulder, and he was tired from the flight and frustrated with the broken wheel on one of his bags. He looked up to find a young man in a burgundy uniform standing beside him, already reaching for the larger suitcase. "Let me help you with that, sir," the bellboy said in perfect English, his accent neutral, his expression pleasant. Daniel started to protest, to say he could manage, but the young man had already taken both suitcases and was gesturing toward the elevator. "Your room number, sir?" Daniel fumbled for his keycard, checked the number printed on the sleeve. 1407. The bellboy nodded and led the way across the marble lobby, walking with the easy confidence of someone who had made this journey 1,000 times. Daniel followed, relieved and grateful, noticing as they walked that the bellboy was younger than he had first appeared, perhaps mid-20s, with neat black hair and a face that seemed somehow familiar, though Daniel was certain they had never met. They rode the elevator in silence, the bellboy holding both suitcases effortlessly, and when they reached the 14th floor, he led Daniel down the hallway to his room, waited while Daniel unlocked the door, and carried the luggage inside. He set the bags down carefully by the closet, straightened, and smiled. "Is there anything else you need, sir?" Daniel shook his head, reached for his wallet to offer a tip, but the bellboy raised a hand politely. "No need, sir. Just doing my job. I hope you enjoy your stay." He left before Daniel could insist, the door closing softly behind him, and Daniel stood there for a moment feeling oddly unsettled by the encounter. There was something about the bellboy's manner, something too formal, too careful, that didn't quite match the casual friendliness of most hotel staff. But Daniel was exhausted, and he pushed the thought aside. Daniel Coe was 29 years old, a freelance journalist from Kuala Lumpur who had come to Singapore for a week to research a feature article about the city's preservation of colonial architecture. He was staying at the Raffles Crown Hotel, a historic property in the downtown area that had been operating continuously since the early 20th century. The hotel had been renovated several times over the decades, but retained much of its original character, with Art Deco flourishes in the lobby and rooms that mixed modern amenities with vintage furniture. Daniel had chosen it specifically for its history, planning to use it as a base while he explored similar buildings around the city. He had arrived late in the afternoon, checked in at the front desk with a cheerful receptionist who gave him his keycard and directions to the elevator. And that was when he had encountered the helpful bellboy. Now, unpacking in his room and reviewing his schedule for the next few days, Daniel felt the pleasant exhaustion of travel settling over him. The room was comfortable, with a view of the street below, and the sound of traffic muted by thick windows. There was a desk, a bed with white linens, a television mounted on the wall, and a bathroom with a shower that looked newly renovated. Everything was clean and functional, exactly what Daniel needed. He ordered room service for dinner, ate while watching the news, and went to bed early. He slept deeply, undisturbed by dreams, and woke the next morning feeling refreshed and ready to work. He showered, dressed, and left the hotel just after 8, spending the day walking through museums and historic districts, taking photographs, and conducting interviews with preservation architects. When he returned to the hotel in the evening, exhausted again but satisfied with his progress, he found the bellboy waiting in the lobby. The young man in the burgundy uniform smiled as Daniel entered, gave a small nod of recognition, and approached. "Good evening, Mr. Coe. Did you have a productive day?" Daniel blinked, surprised that the bellboy remembered his name. "Yes, thank you. Very productive." The bellboy's smile widened slightly. "Excellent. If you need anything during your stay, please don't hesitate to ask. I'm usually here in the evenings." Daniel thanked him and headed to the elevator. But as he rode up to his floor, he found himself wondering about that interaction. He hadn't told the bellboy his name yesterday. He had shown his keycard to confirm the room number, but the sleeve only displayed the room, not the guest's name. Perhaps the bellboy had checked the registry, had made a point of learning the names of guests he had helped. It was thorough, professional, but also oddly personal. Daniel shook off the thought and entered his room. The next 2 days followed a similar pattern. Daniel would leave early, spend the day exploring and researching, and return in the evening to find the bellboy in the lobby. Each time, the young man would greet him by name, ask about his day, and offer assistance in that same polite, careful manner. Daniel began to find it comforting. This consistent presence, this friendly face that seemed genuinely interested in his well-being. On the 4th evening, when Daniel returned to the hotel carrying several heavy books he had purchased from a vintage bookstore, the bellboy immediately offered to carry them up to his room. Daniel accepted, and they rode the elevator together, making small talk about the weather and the city. The bellboy asked about Daniel's research, and Daniel found himself explaining his article in detail, describing the buildings he had visited and the people he had interviewed. The bellboy listened intently, nodding at appropriate moments, and when they reached Daniel's room, he carried the books inside and set them on the desk. He turned to leave, paused at the door, and said something that made Daniel's skin prickle. "Be careful in the old buildings, Mr. Coe. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried as well as we'd like." Then he was gone, the door closing softly, and Daniel stood there wondering what that cryptic statement meant. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed thinking about the bellboy's words, about the strange formality of his manner, about the fact that in 4 days of evening encounters Daniel had never once seen the young man interact with any other guest. He was always alone in the lobby, always waiting, always ready to help, but never busy with other tasks. Daniel got up, turned on his laptop, and searched for information about the Raffles Crown Hotel. The official website showed the usual marketing material, photographs of rooms and amenities, a brief history of the property. But Daniel dug deeper, searching through news archives and historical records, and found something that made his breath catch. 10 years ago, the hotel had suffered a major fire. It had started in the early hours of the morning, in a utility room on the ground floor, and had spread rapidly through the old wooden infrastructure. Most guests had evacuated safely, but 2 staff members had died in the blaze. One was a maintenance worker who had been trapped in the basement. The other was a bellboy, a young man in his mid-20s who had been helping guests evacuate when part of the ceiling collapsed. The article included a photograph of the victims. Daniel stared at the image, his hands suddenly cold. The bellboy in the photograph wore a burgundy uniform identical to the one he had seen every evening for the past 4 days, and his face, smiling in the formal portrait that must have been taken for a staff directory, was the face of the young man who had been carrying Daniel's luggage, asking about his day, warning him about the past. Daniel closed the laptop and sat in the darkness, his mind racing. It wasn't possible. He had spoken to the bellboy, had watched him carry heavy suitcases, had stood next to him in the elevator. Ghosts didn't interact with the physical world like that. Ghosts didn't make small talk about the weather. But Daniel knew what he had seen in that photograph, knew the face as clearly as he knew his own. The next morning, Daniel went to the front desk and asked about the bellboy. He described the young man's appearance, the burgundy uniform, the polite manner, and asked for his name. The receptionist, a different woman from the one who had checked him in, looked confused. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have any bellboys on staff currently. We eliminated that position several years ago as a cost-cutting measure. Guests are welcome to use the luggage carts in the lobby if they need assistance." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "That's not possible," he said. "There's been a young man helping me every evening since I checked in. He knows my name. He's carried my bags to my room." The receptionist frowned and checked her computer. "I assure you, sir, we have no such employee. Perhaps you're thinking of another hotel?" Daniel described the uniform in detail, the burgundy jacket with brass buttons, and the receptionist's expression changed. She became very still, her fingers motionless on the keyboard. "Sir," she said quietly, "that uniform hasn't been used by this hotel in over a decade. We changed to a different design after," she paused, "after the fire." Daniel felt the room tilt. "The fire, where 2 employees died." The receptionist nodded slowly. "Yes, one of them was a bellboy. His name was Marcus Tan. He was very dedicated, very professional. The guests loved him. After his death, several people reported seeing him in the lobby, in the elevators, still trying to help. But those reports stopped years ago. We assumed," she trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Daniel finished the thought for her. "You assumed he had moved on." The receptionist nodded. "Has he spoken to you? Has he done anything?" Daniel shook his head. "He's just been helpful, friendly, normal." The receptionist looked relieved. "Then perhaps it's harmless. Perhaps he just wants to continue doing his job. But, sir, if I may suggest, it's probably best not to engage with him further. Some spirits become attached to the living, and that attachment can become difficult." Daniel went back to his room, packed his belongings mechanically, and checked out that afternoon. He told the receptionist he had finished his research early, that he needed to return to Kuala Lumpur for personal reasons, and she didn't question the lie. As Daniel crossed the lobby, pulling his luggage behind him with the broken wheel scraping against the marble floor, he saw the bellboy standing near the elevator. Marcus Tan, dead, for 10 years, still wearing his burgundy uniform, still ready to help. Their eyes met, and Marcus smiled, that same pleasant professional expression he had worn every evening. He raised one hand in a small wave, and Daniel found himself waving back, a gesture that felt absurd and heartbreaking in equal measure. Then Daniel pushed through the doors and out into the bright afternoon, leaving the Raffles Crown Hotel behind. He never wrote the article. He told his editor the research hadn't panned out, that the story wasn't as interesting as he had hoped, and moved on to other assignments. But he couldn't stop thinking about Marcus Tan, about the young man who had died trying to help hotel guests evacuate, who had remained in death as he had been in life, dedicated and professional, forever performing a job that no longer existed. Daniel wondered if Marcus knew he was dead, if he understood that the guests he helped would never remember him, would never know they had been assisted by a ghost. Or perhaps, Daniel thought, that wasn't the point. Perhaps Marcus simply needed to be useful, needed to fulfill the role he had chosen in life, and death had not released him from that obligation. It was both tragic and comforting, this image of eternal service, and Daniel found himself hoping that Marcus would eventually find peace. But he suspected the bellboy would remain in that lobby for decades more, waiting for guests who needed help, offering assistance with a smile that never quite faded, forever caught in the moment before the ceiling fell and the fire took him. 3 months after leaving Singapore, Daniel was staying in a different hotel for a different assignment, and he made the mistake of taking the elevator alone late at night. He stepped inside, pressed the button for his floor, and as the doors began to close, he glanced at the mirror on the back wall. His reflection looked back at him, tired and slightly disheveled, exactly as he expected. But standing beside, his reflection, visible only in the glass, was another figure, a young man in a burgundy uniform, smiling that familiar professional smile, his hand raised in greeting. Daniel spun around, but the elevator was empty, just him and the 4 walls and the soft hum of machinery. He looked back at the mirror. Marcus Tan was still there, still smiling, still standing at Daniel's shoulder, as if waiting to carry luggage that didn't exist. The elevator reached Daniel's floor, and the doors opened. Daniel stepped out quickly, not looking back, but he knew without checking that if he returned to that elevator, If he wrote it again at night and glanced at the mirror, Marcus would be there. Not threatening, not angry, just present. A helpful ghost doing his job, following the guest he had bonded with, unable or unwilling to let go of that connection. Daniel never took elevators alone after that. He always waited for other people, always stood where he couldn't see his reflection, always moved quickly from floor to floor. Because he understood now what the receptionist had meant about attachment, about the danger of engaging too much with the dead. Marcus Tan had been kind in life and remained kind in death, but kindness from a ghost was still a haunting, still a presence that followed you from hotel to hotel, city to city, visible only in mirrors and reflections, waiting patiently to help with bags you weren't carrying, to offer assistance you didn't need, to remind you that some debts of gratitude transcend the boundary between life and death. And once a ghost decides you need their help, once they attach themselves to your reflection, they never really leave. They just wait in the mirrors, smiling their professional smiles, forever ready to serve. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.